What is up, you guys, and welcome back to the Prime Vanguard channel. And as you've seen by today's introduction, we will be discussing my Jewel Knight deck profile that I took to Springfest Rosemont. I was so quick to say BCS, I don't know why that always happens to me. I took this deck to Springfest Rosemont and I actually had a really good time with it. I did go 3-3 with the deck out of the 6 rounds that we played. I went 3-3 with it. I think it was 6 or 7 rounds, I don't remember. But I went 3-3 with it, I do remember that. And it was just so much fun and nice to play Jewel Knights. As you guys know, I've been playing Jewel Knights since their introduction in V-Clan Collection Volume 1. I have incorporated the Jewel Knight engine in so many decks, and going into this tournament, I definitely had a lot of confidence with this deck. Between Jewel Knights and Leopold, which was the other deck I was going to take, I simply felt better with this deck only because I've had more experience with Jewel Knights compared to Leopold. I think that Leopold is honestly one of the top 5 best decks in V Premium right now just because of the insane speed the deck has. But despite how powerful Leopold is, I truly do believe that whenever you go to a big tournament like this, a regional, Springfest, BCS, whatever, I do believe it's more important to play with your gut and the deck you are more familiar with than the deck that is the best at the moment. Because I think that I would have done worse with Leopold despite how good the deck is, because I don't understand the build I need to play, the card choices I was making, and sort of what the deck wants to do. I mean, I know that it gives power, you get excel and things like that, but with this deck, I can play this deck and I know when I win, I know when I lose, and I know my best hands and my worst hands, and I know how to get out of those situations. And that's just simply why I took this deck over Leopold to the event, and I think that looking back on it now, I do not regret my decision whatsoever. I'm very well aware that I think Leopold was like top 5 decks in the event for Overdress, not Overdress, my bad. I think it was top 5 of the decks for V Premium, but I don't regret my decision to take Jewel Knights to the event. I think that Jewel Knights are a very fast-paced deck. They have a lot of consistency. Their Vanguard has insanely strong skill. Like Ashlei's skill is just, it does everything you would want an aggro deck Vanguard to do, and the being a part of the Force clan or nation, whatever you want to call it, getting the Force 1 or Force 2 to maintain control or to pick the aggro style play that you want to actually come up a lot in the tournament. I mainly went Force 2 for most of my games because I was just rushing so hard and being so aggressive against most of my opponents, and they were expecting that because of just what Jewel Knights do by nature. And I just feel as though this was the better pick for me. It's a lot of power in the Vanguard circle. You're going Force 2, you have Guard Restrict, Multi-Attack, all of your cards cycle out, you get to draw cards, search out cards. Like, this deck really does everything. The only thing it does not do is just draw a lot of cards toward the end of the turn. You really are expelling a lot of cards either from your hand, or you are using a lot of cards to block early because, again, this deck does not draw a lot of cards towards the end of your turn or towards you are doing your attack patterns. So therefore, you really want to block those attacks early so that this way you can take punishment later in the game. So decks like Leopold or Davis that want to go into their Lambros turn or their Leopold reverse turns and rush you really, really hard, you don't have to commit as many pieces or expect as many damage triggers to survive because you kept your damage low. That was my strategy going into it in terms of gameplay, and I think my plan worked for the most part. The games that I lost, I will say that one of them I lost because I made too many misplays. The other one was because I did not see my Broken Heart Jewel Knight Ashlei reverse. Like, the girl really did break my heart. And the third part of that was the fact that my opponent was just very familiar with my deck. He knew how to counteract my deck and play against it, and he was just very consistent. He actually ended up going to top the event. If I have a picture, I will post it, or I will talk about it in my community tab once I get done posting this and discuss that. But I love this deck. I still think that Jewel Knights are an incredible deck to play, and towards the next event that we have that is a big event for Vanguard, it might be between this deck and Leopold that I take for the next tournament. After going to this event and taking time to look at the deck and reflect on my pieces and my choices, I have not touched the deck or made any changes since the event, and at the time making this video, we are now going into June 1st. We are 1 day away from that. So I've had a little bit of time to, I guess, take a back step and learn from my mistakes. This is still the most comfortable build that I have with Jewel Knights, and I will be showcasing it and discussing my thoughts on the future of this deck towards the end of this video, and my concluding thoughts on what sort of changes or tweaks I would make to Jewel Knights for this deck, if any. With that being said, Cardfighters, we will now move on to camera 2 and go ahead and get this deck profile started. Alright, you guys, so to get this profile started off with, we have 4 copies of the lovely Broken Heart Jewel Knight Ashlei reverse. Ashlei Reverse is without a doubt one of the strongest Vanguards in V Premium. Her ability to reset your entire board, retire your opponent's units, get Sentinel Restrict and multi-attack while amassing a lot of power. This card just does so much as a Vanguard. It literally has all of the best archetypes that you'd want from different aggro decks into one card. Everything that this card gives you is honestly insane, and the Dual Knight support makes it super consistent, which means that we have a Vanguard that has access to its entire archetype that consistently supports its strategy. And the biggest flaw about this card is simply that the Soul Blasting 2 is hard to reach sometimes. You know, if you don't have proper setup and you're not making sure that you're soul charging correctly, reaching her ability can be difficult. You need to make sure that you're paying attention to how much soul that you use, and you need to make sure that you're setting up your soul properly with other card effects from your Dual Knight units, so that this way when you use her first ability, you don't have to struggle to get her effect off. But besides that, the main weakness of this card is very minuscule, as soul charging and setting up is not hard for this deck whatsoever. Getting the 6 card in soul is not a difficult feat by any means necessary. It just can be an issue sometimes if you do not have the proper setup to do so. But if you play this deck for a while like I have, then 9 times out of 10, you always will have that effect active. There aren't any flaws with this card. The aggro it gives is just honestly broken, guys. It really is super strong. The main flaw about Dual Knights themselves, and not just this card, is the fact that the deck is a bit of a glass cannon deck. While you do have mass superior calling and her abilities give you these multi-attacks as well as large amounts of power, you don't amass a lot of cards, which is the main weakness of Dual Knights in general. But with a deck that plays like this and the Vanguard basically doing everything you want it to, it's not that big a deal to really have because you are trying to finish your games out quickly. I truly do believe that with Ashlei Reverse, Force 2 is also the way to go. I've noticed from watching other players that this is sort of the direction they're taking as well, as everything this card does, you want to go Force 2 anyway. The Sentinel Restrict, the multi-attack, yes, you're going to miss out on some of the power from your units, but that's perfectly fine because you're relying on your Vanguard's attack to be the killing blow. Moving on to my next grade 3, I am playing 4 copies of Pure Heart's Dual Knight Ashlei. Now, as the other grade 3 in this deck, you actually don't want to ride this card. Her secondary ability, give +1 critical, is great, and if you have to ride her because you don't have a Ashlei Reverse to go into, that's perfectly fine. This card still gives you multi-attack, and it works on the Vanguard or Rearguard circles through any period of this game. The card is always useful. It's also how you generate your 5 to 6 attack combos besides Ashlei Reverse if you don't have the proper setup to go into Ashlei Reverse, or if this card is in play and you have the soul to do so. It's really just the multi-attacking piece, and that's all it's for. You never want to ride this card, and if you do have to ride this card, you are trying everything in your power to get into Ashlei Reverse. Because while this card is great and doesn't cost many resources, a lot of the cards that you play in this deck are focused around Ashlei Reverse, such as the Miranda and the All-Wins, and the way that you utilize other cards is what you want to do. It is really slow to have this card because you have to change the way you play the deck in order to make it work if you have to stick on this card. But other than giving multi-attacks and being a nice secondary ride target, this card is not bad whatsoever. I do think it's better than Salome just because Salome eats away a lot of your hand, and since the deck is no longer built around Salome, I think that this is overall the better secondary ride than she would be for Ashlei Reverse. Moving on to my grade 2s, I am playing 3 copies of Banding Dual Knight Miranda. Now, Miranda is honestly the MVP of Dual Knights in terms of offense. This card works so well with Ashlei Reverse, and if you get the double Force 2 setup, it's insane. It's like 2 Vanguard attacks in one single turn, and that's her biggest thing. She's a resource management card that gives you the counter charge needed, so there are some shenanigans you can do with Miranda to make sure that you have your Vanguard skill and get the benefit of this card as well. She soul charges, so she's a good ride target as well to boost up your soul before you go into Ashlei Reverse, and again, she masses a lot of power. And moving on to every Dual Knight player's favorite grade 2, we have Explode Dual Knight's Lael. Now, Lael is probably the most important Dual Knight grade 2. This is how you get all of your multi-attacks, the power needed to hit thresholds. Since you're not using Force 1 in this deck at all, you're going Force 2. A lot of the times you're going to have Lael in the front row to recycle large amounts of your Dual Knight cards, get the 5k, and then call over her and then activate her secondary skill. Everything this card does is huge for this deck. It's how you amass the resources to use your Vanguard skill, it's how you get the extra soul charge, and it's a good rushing piece as well. You can drop these cards early, and if your opponent doesn't start swinging at your rear guards, you can call rear guards over when you go into your Pure Heart Dual Knight Ashlei or Ashlei Reverse, and you can start powering up your rear guards when using their abilities. Even if they do start hitting these, because you are a normal unit as well, it's not a minus for this deck because you're just going to recycle the pieces back in, and that'll trigger Ashlei Reverse's skill when you have different targets, and you can bring this card out. It sets up for next turn. It makes everything that you have hit a magic number, since this deck is using Force 2 and not Force 1 ever, and it's just overall one of the best supporting pieces that this deck has. In terms of offense, it is a key piece, and that's why I'm playing for this over other Mirandas, because besides this, I just don't think that Miranda is good over her in terms of slots in the deck. I do think that maxing out your Jewel Knights is important, but I actually think that this card overall is the better supporting piece because she makes everything you play over into a magic number, which is really a big deal to me, guys, because other than your Vanguard attack, your other rearguards attacks are not that powerful. Like, yes, you have Miranda that hits the magic number if your Vanguard is high, but you're locking your entire back row to use Ashlei versus skill, so your Jewel Knights are really relying on their own card effects, or they're relying on triggers to make them work. Next up, I play 4 copies of Dogmatized Jewel Knight Sybil. So I'm maxing out 4 copies of Sybil because Sybil is a great digging piece as well as resource management piece. This is the card I use to start filtering my deck out so I can start seeing the Jewel Knight pieces that I want prior to going to Ashlei Reverse or just building up soul for Ashlei Reverse. She's also a great card as well in terms of her secondary ability to call stuff over, because if I don't like the targets that I have for my Ashlei Reverse's effect that I call out prior to using her on attack skill, then Sybil just lets me start thinning my deck out for the other Jewel Knight pieces that I want for the skills. It's really important to start seeing those all-wins get the power up to the Vanguard to make your Vanguard scarier. It's to see Lael so that your next set of attacks hit higher power. And then it's also a good piece to get free resources on the board. Again, Jewel Knights do not generate a lot of card advantage in terms of adding cards to your hand at the end of their turn. They need every sort of resource management that they can get, and Sybil is just a great piece for doing that. Calling out those Jewel Knight pieces you want prior to Ashlei Reverse is extremely helpful, and filtering your deck out so that you can see your grade 3 Ashlei Reverse as soon as possible is extremely helpful. Moving on to my grade 1s, so the only non-Jewel Knight card that I play is 2 copies of Laurel Knight Sisylis. I actually think that Sisylis is a card that I am now, after the tournament, in between, only because I just feel as though the idea behind this card is thin your deck out for Ashlei Reverse, because if you don't see Ashlei Reverse, guys, you are honestly in a super tough spot. Ashlei Reverse is how you push your aggro, it's the main Vanguard you want to see, and Pure Heart is just not that great anymore. Decks in V Premium are moving so fast now, you really want to see your main boss monster and force your opponent to drop a lot of cards to stop your Ashlei Reverse's attack. And even if they can't expel the cards from their hand to do so, forcing them to have to take an attack if they don't have the Healed Guardian really does suck. This card also discards a card from your hand, which means in the early game, you can start getting rid of those cards to use the abilities of your other Jewel Knights to recycle in the back end, get that extra soul charge in. So it's a free discarding target and a nice little rush card as well, because you can just drop these onto the rearguard and not care because they're not Jewel Knight pieces. It's not like you're going to recycle them back anyway, unless you don't have any other normal unit targets to go into. And then they get free power on turn 2, first turn. That means that they get past the quick shield, so they're good rush targets as well. This is the only slot in the deck that I feel like is questionable, because if I didn't play this, I'd probably be playing another Miranda and maybe 1 copy of Salome, only because those are more Jewel Knight named, and at that point I'd be playing fully pure, but these have been pretty helpful so far. I'm just mentioning the fact that in your build, you can change these out for something else. For my next grade 1, I am playing 4 copies of Charging Jewel Knight Morvidius. Now, Morvidius is without a doubt probably the MVP of Jewel Knights, because since set 1, this card has honestly been amazing. Being able to give you a free draw and replace herself, as well as being the only card in the deck that lets you continuously soul charge if need be, actually has been extremely helpful. There have been times where I have used the Counterblast 2 to fill up my soul to meet the criteria for my Ashlei Reverse and power my Vanguard up by 10,000 max with this card. If you don't have all wins to go into and you have extra CB to do so, as long as you leave 1 open for your Ashlei Reverse, you're honestly fine to throw your Counterblast away anything, because the only thing you're using your CB for ever in this deck really is Miranda and Ashlei Reverse. Very rarely have I had to do that, which is okay if you have to, but I'm just saying very rarely I have to do that, and the card itself replaces itself too, so it's a great to ride target, a great rear guard, and it's a great recycler as well, because this Counterblast in the deck doesn't go anywhere except obviously to the 2 cards, so when you do have spare CB to use, you can expel it on this card to get your resources back up and make that Ashlei Reverse work at full power. Next up, I play 4 copies of Fruiting Jewel Knight Eunice. Now, Eunice is still an amazing Jewel Knight in terms of the early game. This card is something you can call out to start rushing early or blocking early, simply for the fact that in the matchups where you need to start knocking out the pieces that your opponent is playing that are in the back row, when you're playing against those annoying Thawis matchups or Leopold matchups, you can drop this card on the board and just use her effect to start popping cards. It's a great way of getting rid of their front row and getting the stuff they might have in the back row that might be annoying. For example, the Toucan bird that lets them bounce stuff back, one of their boosters. For Thawis, it's definitely Nikki or Adelaide if they have it in the back row. If they're keeping it there for any other reason, those are all great targets to get rid of. I also think that in terms of ride targets, she's just as good as Morvidius. The card honestly does everything you want it to do in terms of offense. It retires, it draws, it bounces back to hand, and it soul charges while recycling your normal units for Jewel Knights. Truly is one of the best pieces in the early game that we have. Later game, it's not the greatest, only because we are going to lock our back row for our Vanguard's abilities. So I really do like taking advantage of this card in the early game to rush my opponent with, since I know for a fact I'm not going to take advantage of all of its skills later in the game, unless the matchup requires it. And for my final grade 1 and the MVP of Jewel Knights, 4 copies of Security Jewel Knights All-Win. Now, All-Win, without a doubt, is the best supporting Jewel Knight grade 1 for Ashlei Reverse. Her ability to rest herself soul charge gives 5k to the Vanguard, which means Ashlei Reverse is always hitting magic numbers with this card because you're getting an additional 5k to get past the 15,000 bonus, and on top of the fact that her ride ability is great as well. When she's called over, you can start filtering your deck out for exact Jewel Knight pieces, so if we're really having a hard time getting to our Ashlei Reverse, we can just start calling other cards over this and then start recycling so that we can start digging our deck out for Ashlei Reverse when need be. In terms of being a great ride target on the rear guard and a call target over on the Vanguard circle as well, the card does everything that it needs to in terms of resource management. It's how we dig out for certain Jewel Knight pieces prior to getting to our Ashlei Reverse, or if we need our Ashlei Reverse and it gives power to the Vanguard, while not feeling like we're minusing and it's not doing anything because we are going to lock this in the back row. Idealistically speaking, having 3 copies of these in the back row is the ideal setup. You just start giving up 15k to your Vanguard while recycling and soul charging en masse, means that with ease, your Vanguard can easily hit the Soul Blast 6 criteria to use her full power. Now for my triggers, and this is where my lineup has changed since I showcased my Jewel Knight deck in a long time. I am playing a split on the heels, 4 draw PGs, as well as a critical. Now, I know that a lot of Jewel Knight players from the list that I've seen like to go 10 crit or this route, and I actually think that this route is the best. The Healed Guardians still do their job, which is perfectly fine because you want to slow down your opponent in the early game, and they're also searchable because we are playing Sisylis. I do think that the E-lanes are important as well, simply because in the later game, since Jewel Knight is not amassing a lot of cards, you're not really going to have like a huge hand like these other decks will. So 5 to 6 cards in hand, you really want to max out on the shield value that you have and start guarding early, so that this way you can make sure that you're able to take a beating later in the game. So that extra 5k on the shield does come up, it does matter. Therefore, I felt like 2 of these was perfectly fine because I value the 2 of these as well. Draw PGs, I wasn't even going to play with it with the crit PGs, and the 8 critical is just normal. This trigger lineup is very generic and very solid, and I think that with the way that Jewel Knights play, I would not make a single change to it other than this that I've made prior to the tournament. And to top it all off, I am playing the Shining Knight Milius as my starter. And that concludes my Jewel Knights deck profile. Now, as I've stated throughout the entirety of this deck profile, I am very satisfied with this list. I think a lot of the card choices that I made, as well as decisions that I chose, were the correct ones. The very few choices that I would make, like I said, would be adding Salome over Sisylis, or maybe a card that is another consistency piece to give me that extra card advantage in the early game, or discard some cards out so I can start filtering with my Jewel Knight cards if I'm not hitting my Ashlei Reverse. Those are all ideas, but right now I am very satisfied with this list. I'm very happy with it, and I'm going to keep trying it just for a little bit longer. I might try out the changes that I have discussed, if any, and then if I feel as though there's anything new for this deck I want to showcase, I'll bring it to you guys firsthand. But as of right now, I'm very satisfied with my Jewel Knight deck profile. I still think that Jewel Knights have the chance to be a high tier deck. I already think they're a high tier deck, but I think that they still have a really strong game plan against most of the meta decks, their style of play, their aggro, what the Vanguard does. The deck just has a lot of great things going for it, and I look forward to seeing other Jewel Knight decks coming out as we are reaching the conclusion of all of our Springfest events, and I'm looking forward to seeing what changes people are making with the new meta coming in. With that being said, Cardfighters, tell me your thoughts on my Jewel Knights deck and how I can improve it, and I will see you later. Peace.